to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. We are coming to you live in the middle of what could be the Third Intifada. It appears that Hamas has launched a surprise attack on the occupying Zionist authorities with their headquarters in Tel Aviv. The Gaza Strip has been alight with bombings. We have people paragliding in from the West Bank, from the Gaza Strip, captured air defenses, captured tanks, military bases have been captured. Reportedly, 4 helicopters have been shot down. We were saying this earlier. It appears there's now just a live Fortnite server active in the Holy Land right now. This is World War Now, episode 46. We are coming at you with a whole lot of news today, even more than what's going on right now in Israel, Palestine. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, and yeah, as always, like exciting news. But this week, I mean, it's even more live, and essentially the Middle East is on fire at the moment. And typically, like we have spoken about how the Middle East tends to be rather quiet, or has tended to be, especially this summer. But it looks like it's really warming up, especially around the Levant. And so the Palestine, the Holy Land, right now, the Hamas militants of Palestine, or as they'd like to call themselves, the freedom fighters, fighting for the freedom of Palestine, have in fact broken out of their cage in which the Israelis have built a massive fence around Gaza. Gaza considered it's essentially right on the coast of the Mediterranean, and it's one of the main residents of the Palestinian people, besides the West Bank of the Jordan in the northeast corner of Israel. But the Gaza city, this territory, right? This like a territory city in and of itself. The Israelis have, well, years ago, walled it off with a massive fence, and finally this fence has been breached by essentially what we're looking at is roughly around 1,000 Hamas militants now actually fighting 20 to 30 kilometers outside of this Gaza designated zone against what seems to be like armed Israeli army soldiers. So, and Israel has officially announced, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has announced that Israel is at war. So on one hand, we have them calling these people terrorists. On the other hand, they're essentially admitting that Palestine is some sort of like a state in and of itself, and Israel has declared formal war on it, right? Because terrorists, they're either on one hand terrorists and essentially militants of a non-existing state, or on the other hand, they're actually the soldiers of an existing Palestinian government on whom Israel has declared war. Or this is a war on terror. Either way, Israel apparently is in a state of war, and the entire southern Israeli, essentially everything south of Jerusalem, is declared as a state of emergency, especially the city of Beersheba. Coincidentally, the city of Beersheba was having apparently a transgender alphabet community festival just a day before this event took place. So while all the members of the alphabet community were sleeping, the paragliders from Gaza were actually getting over the fence, and they took over the nearest military base, I think. So this is how this Third Intifada began. Essentially, it began with a night of sin from the Israelis, of course, not paying attention, and the Hamas militants have taken over, at least in the beginning, it was one police station and one military base of the Israeli Defense Force, and it seems to have been escalating ever since.
And we are exactly 50 years and 1 day out from the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, where Egypt and other, allied forces against Israel launched one of the biggest threats to the biggest threat to Israel's existence at its time since its conception in 1948. And as of this recording, I'm sure these numbers are going to go up. We have over 100 dead, over 1,000 wounded. This really is like a full-on war. We always we cover the attacks and the bombings that come from, whether it's something from Lebanon, whether it's coming from the West Bank. Usually, of course, then it comes from Gaza. There's skirmishes, there's terrorist attacks, whether it's shootings or truck attacks. There are operations on the site of the Al-Aqsa mosque and where the Temple Mount used to be, where the Israeli soldiers very often commit what you could describe as terrorism against Muslim and even Christian worshippers there. So this is a very big deal. Netanyahu has said we're in a state of war. The head of the IDF has said we're in a state of war. And now at this point, we're really watching the reactions of the other countries involved. And of course, the biggest surprise to me came when Saudi Arabia basically very quickly released a statement blaming Israel for the current aggression, the current provocation and situation where now thousands and probably going to end up being dead. Of course, the UAE was more tentative, called for immediate peace. The King of Jordan actually appears to be standing with the Palestinians. And of course, Biden has come out in defense of Israel, warning very recently any other outside actors. I think he's explicitly addressing Hezbollah and other forces in Lebanon to the north, saying that they should not use this as an opportunity to open another front against Israel. And as of right now, it appears that Hezbollah is standing by. I hope we can get this episode out as soon as possible because this is a very dynamic situation. So be sure to follow World War Now Telly on Telegram, World War Now _ on Twitter. We're going to be covering this, as long as it goes on, right? I remember when the SMO started, I didn't sleep for 4 days. This may be another one of those situations. And of course, there's a prophetic element here because, we're past 70 years of Israel's existence just a few years back. And St. Paisios himself spoke about, the Al-Aqsa mosque will eventually be destroyed. And, the state of Israel, the Zionist state, will cease to exist. And, this ties into a lot of stuff we've been talking about recently on World War Now and Ether Hour with we're going to get into the new heavenly Jerusalem and how it very much relates to how this war we're witnessing right now could turn out. And of course, Iran obviously is going to be supporting the Palestinians, but of course, unlike all the other countries renamed, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, Iran is, much more geographically separated from Israel. And of course, Syria, we're going to discuss this big element of it. Syria is currently tied down with some of the biggest Turkish strikes and Turkish incursions going on. Of course, they're often fighting the Kurds, who are also activated and funded by the United States. So unfortunately, Assad's Syrian Arab army, even if they wanted to assist, what they would consider their allies in the Israel front, they are very much tied down with what I perceive as an Israeli ally in the Turks, and of course in the United States.
Yeah, naturally speaking, we do need to mention that Syria, of all countries, does have exclusive gripes of Israel because during the Donald Trump administration, while Syria was almost completely divided and almost on the brink of the destruction of its statehood was very much imminent until the Russians, of course, stepped in and began supporting it. There was the stealing of the Golan Heights, and Israel has finally added this extra, essentially annexed a piece of Syria for itself. So the Golan Heights territory in the north, in the far northeast corner of Israel, is actually technically Syrian territory. So in fact, it's not just Hezbollah in the north that Israel has to worry about, but also potentially small incursions of the Syrian army of Assad, possibly if things, of course, get out of hand. But in terms of numbers, what we're looking at from Hamas, we're not too sure what exactly Hamas could gather in terms of overall force, but Hezbollah, at least in 2017, had at least 25,000 Lebanese militants up in the north of Israel, and maybe 20 to 30,000 more reservists, actually people trained in order to fight this holy war against Israel sometime in the future. And the rhetoric, as you mentioned, from Iran has always been anti-Israeli for, you can say the last 50 years since the Iranian Revolution. And that rhetoric has, of course, spilled over into Iran's, you could say, satellite organizations such as Hamas. Well, Hamas technically is kind of on its own, but Hezbollah definitely has been trained by Iranian intelligence and is pretty much ready to go. And in fact, the Egyptian intelligence, they have sort of spread a message that Hezbollah is ready, is kind of on the standby, as they should be, because again, in a hot situation such as this, everybody around Israel needs to be on the ready. It's very interesting how the King of Jordan actually spoke out in favor of the Palestinians, and it maybe even be a precursory sort of comment, just because if we remember the events of Black October and all those events, all those decades ago, the Jordanians are somewhat on the receiving end of not just Palestinian refugees crossing the Jordan. If Israel begins really slapping down, their sort of justice on the Palestinian residents of Israel, Jordan will be on the receiving end of those Palestinian refugees. So the King of Jordan does need to kind of paint this message of, well, look, if refugees start coming to us, we will be accepting them, and we're kind of a bit more ready to even morally kind of accept them because, hey, look, we're somewhat in favor of this population, and we're in favor of their rights, especially in Gaza and maybe even the West Bank. So I understand the King of Jordan's comments, but you're right, it is surprising because the King of Jordan usually is somewhat pro-Israeli or even very, very neutral. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting development here in Gaza. Most countries, of course, have spoken out in favor of Israel, including, unfortunately, the president of Serbia and Vucic. Countries like Russia have again commented that, look, neutrality should be sustained and everybody should aim for peace, including Patriarch Kirill himself openly stated that, like, a neutral stance should be approached. And, this neutrality is categorized through peace. Essentially, the country should return to peace and some sort of peace talk should begin. And maybe a two-state solution should be implemented in the long term. But of course, we know that the Israeli Zionist state will not go for the two-state solution, as they've rejected it many times through ignoring various United Nations resolutions since the beginning of the State of Israel in the 1940s. So we know the way the Israelis want to run things is through a forceful annexation or segregation type style, which is why the Gaza Strip even has this massive fence around it, which is now being apparently, well, sections of the fence have been officially bulldozed, which has led to really epic sort of imagery of Palestinian bulldozers breaking the fence down. And it is very interesting, this type of combat where, and I agree with Alexander Dugin, he says that it's very valiant seeing the Palestinians fight back against the much stronger Israeli army, which, mind you, has not unleashed its full strength as of yet. So at the moment, we are still kind of waiting for the Israeli response and waiting for Netanyahu, whose office was in much strife recently politically. As you know, like Conrad, we've covered it somewhat, that Israel politically is very divided. They have a very intense, you could say, parliament with very many different factions, and recently they have had the judicial dispute. Their Supreme/High Court has been, they've had a lot of issues politically and judicially speaking. So Netanyahu's prime ministership and his party rule is very much in question, and this is a huge breach of, I guess, Israeli security, right? Unless this was some inside job psyop, but it looks like Israeli security, Israeli intelligence did not see this coming. And I know it was the Shabbat too, mind you. It's Saturday, it's a Shabbat, so most Jews simply, and Orthodox Jews simply don't really work or put in any sort of effort on this alleged holy day. So exactly who messed up here, the Israelis will be probably looking into this particular breach of security, or it will just develop into an outright war and nobody will have time to frankly even investigate what exactly took place in the first instance.
Yeah, I mean, the questions of where this came about, how it was such a surprise, those are spinning around. Of course, it is obvious that this isn't a massive, trans-Muslim, operation. Obviously, the Palestinian authorities didn't even necessarily have Hamas to start this with, so it's very much grassroots from within Palestine itself. But I think some have commented that this is coming on the Palestinians getting word of a big possible deal coming between Saudi Arabia and Israel and other groups brokered by the United States. So some are saying this could be a big last-ditch attempt. Others are saying this has been planned for a while because of, its relation to with the one in the Yom Kippur War in the 1960s. And as of right now, it appears that Biden has signed over $8 billion in weapons support to Israel. Of course, this comes as Biden has toned down his support for sending weapons to Zelensky. So, of course, perhaps this is part of the off-ramp, is now we need to support Israel against its fight against, the Iranian-funded menace, whether, that's, Syrian. Because remember, I mean, you mentioned Syria's grief for the Golan Heights. Syria would have more of a pretext to launch an attack like this on it. Israel bombs the Damascus airport and Syrian territory all the time, basically every week. So I think it's very clear that without all of the nonsense going on in the north and the ISIS remnants going on in the east of Syria, the Syrian Arab army could very well be assisting the Palestinian forces, at least peripherally, maybe not engaging territory itself, because of course the Syrian Arab army and Assad's main benefactors are Putin, and Putin does not want to see, I don't think, the Zionist state fall. Unfortunately, despite the fact that it is getting weaker than ever, Israel has, barring some big deal that I just mentioned, Israel has been on the retreat from its foreign policy perspective recently. And in general, they are not, as powerful as they were definitely during the Trump administration. And if this leads to a further deterioration, like you said, with relations with Saudi Arabia and Jordan and these other places, it would seem that, with the exception of moving the embassy to Jerusalem and I guess the recognition of the Golan Heights, that the Abraham Accords did nothing more than to serve lead to a big problem for the Israeli people who are now isolated and under a united assault from a Muslim front. We're just going to have to see how it goes.
Yeah, and of course, what's happening on the ground now will, of course, only encourage at least those Jews who are very fervently Zionist to defend their own state. So let's not make any mistakes. It's not like Israel is somehow losing morale. Yes, Israel does have a lot of members of the alphabet community. We mentioned how Tel Aviv is 25%, essentially 25% of the residents of Tel Aviv actually consider themselves members of that particular rainbow community, which is very bizarre. So it's almost the most populated, country of those particular people per capita. The festival, which was happening right outside of Gaza as well, is evidence of that. And also the fact that the majority of Israel is literally triple or quadruple vaxxed as well, which so they took on basically every single trait of degenerate Western ideology that they could. But on top of that, they also have that almost like a Second Amendment type vision where every Israeli man has military training. Every Israeli man, even women actually, are typically they are trained in how to use assault rifles. They have assault rifles at home. They have very broad weapons rights. And so, in fact, as soon as Hamas essentially breaks through, if they do push out further than say 30 kilometers out of Gaza, what they'll encounter is essentially some populations of Orthodox Jews as well as even secular Jews who are armed to the teeth, and you'll have house-to-house combat and essentially carnage of a type that we hypothetically speak of if the United States has ever essentially invaded on the ground, which essentially is why Israel was essentially probably even took on this doctrine of arming and preparing all of its citizens for this potential breakthrough in case any hostile Arab army, either from the north, from the east, or from the south, ever made it this far. And so that's essentially what we're going to see. And all that footage, like, again, we're recording this 8 hours after the event has begun, but we have footage of they look like dead civilians in gruesome places, for example, on fences, on roads, or by the roadside, and you're not sure who exactly killed them or murdered them, but people need to make sure that they understand these people may not have been unarmed civilians. They may have been actually armed and actually shooting back either at Hamas or at the IDF, and it's hard to even ethnically tell apart who's who, right? Because you have these Middle Eastern Jews who look exactly like the Palestinian Arabs, right? So even physically, they almost look the same, and in fact, it's very confusing from the first-hand footage to even tell what has transpired in some of these places. But some of the most disturbing footage, at least now, or less than 10 hours after the beginning of this event, was probably the footage of the Israeli military women and just Israeli people being kidnapped by the Palestinians and taken back into Gaza, and of course some of the Israeli soldiers having blood on them. And this is kind of disturbing, of course, thoughts of like some sort of mass sexual assault going on in these particular villages and towns by the Palestinian Hamas. Like, these images do come to mind, but again, I'm not too sure exactly how the Palestinian Muslims are treating these particular prisoners, especially of the female sex. But we do need to consider that these images will be used as hard propaganda for the Israeli nation in order to mobilize. And Netanyahu has announced that all reservists in the Israeli army are being called upon to fight. So everything is being mobilized. Its mobilization is as broad as that in the Ukraine. Of course, there is no draft announced, but there are at least 20 to 50,000 reservists being called to arms in Israel, and footage of Israeli women being taken as hostages back into Gaza, into like the den of the Palestinian beast in the eyes of the Israelis, will be used as propaganda. So there's that to consider too.
Yeah, this is, again, we're recording this at the time when there's, a little over 100 dead, I think, confirmed. That number is probably higher than it really is. But at this time as well, General Nimrod Aloni was captured by Hamas, and this is one of those things where if this situation hasn't actually dramatically increased, probably by the time you're even listening to this recording, it's likely that this won't be going as well as the Palestinian militants would have liked. They're going to need to capture more military leaders, seize more territory, and probably gain the support of Hezbollah, if not something else, because it seems that the United States is now willing to send intercontinental ballistic missiles to Israel, and Israel's, the ground invasion is on the table, and we're seeing just this footage from Gaza. I mean, this entire massive, 1,000+ person apartment buildings and things are being completely leveled by the Israeli Air Force. So they're going to, trust me, they've gotten their go-to. And we know that, people talk about the Zionist regime, that they're genocidal. They want to wipe out all of the non-Jewish settlers everywhere in the region, even the greater Israel region that we've talked about before, which is much bigger than the current allotment of land that they have. And these are just, again, Gaza is the most densely populated region of the world. And so they're able to just carpet bomb these areas and just take out thousands, of Gentiles who they perceive as, a lot of them perceive as, not really human. So it's really, this is a very dynamic conflict. We're going to be continuing to follow it closely, and it's going to dramatically affect every other conflict, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Armenia, Azerbaijan, even Serbia, Kosovo. So, well, even China, Taiwan. So we, as we believe, both literally and of course symbolically, Jerusalem is at the center of the universe. And so this is going to reverberate outwards. Very big World War now moment. And it's very much a possible escalation point for the Third World War, if not just a big escalation in something that will eventually lead to a conflict between major states like Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States, and even the Western European countries as well. So this is amazing. I mean, I'm not saying that positively, but last night before I went to bed, I was just seeing some crazy footage of, just the Iron Dome working and huge airstrikes coming in. It looked bigger than normal, and I was like, oh wow, that's interesting. And then I woke up and boom, looks like the Third Intifada, for better or for worse. The next big thing has really begun. So this is biblical.
Absolutely, and I mean, even some of the words being used by both sides. Let's just say the Hamas Palestinians have actually named this operation not a special military operation. They've officially called it a jihad. We've seen, so they actually call the operation the flood, the Al-Aqsa flood, and they're saying, look, we're going to flood, and like maybe it's even a throwback to Noah perhaps, but they're saying they're going to cleanse the land of sin, and they're going to clear. I mean, their official statements have already mentioned the fact that they're going all the way to Jerusalem, and they're going to protect the Al-Aqsa mosque from being destroyed because they said the Zionist state wants to build a third temple. Like that is the official modus operandi of Hamas, and that's their mission, is to save the Al-Aqsa mosque, which is, from, I guess, an Islamic perspective, that's pretty noble, and it's almost like a pro-Muslim crusade of some sort. But, again, it's not like there's an active conspiracy to destroy the mosque. There probably is, actually, but I'm not sure how local it is to this particular time frame. But we need to consider, like, from an Orthodox perspective, just the Orthodox communities living both in Jerusalem and Hebron, all the monasteries along the West Bank up north, and even there aren't that many communities next to Gaza, thankfully. So we haven't seen any footage of churches burning or of either side actually attacking any Orthodox Christians yet. But if this particular Third Intifada actually strikes further east, you will hit regions such as Hebron and up north. Jerusalem is apparently very, very well protected by the IDF. So Jerusalem is a nut which will be difficult to crack, especially considering geographically it's very mountainous. So Israel probably has a bunch of bunkers as well as different defense mechanisms set up along the southwest and the northeastern side of Jerusalem. So it's probably going to be very hard for any sort of intifada, and I'm talking about a really massive escalation here, to actually break into Jerusalem at this point. But even places like Hebron have massive Orthodox Greek as well as Russian Orthodox monasteries, which is probably why the Russian Orthodox Church and even Russia itself has reacted very quickly. They know exactly that these communities, which we speak about, and I think it was one of the earlier A4Hour episodes about the holy, the Holy Land and the mission of the Orthodox in this particular Palestinian region has been very active for a long time. So there are churches, monasteries that go way back hundreds of years, and our Orthodox Christian presence in this region is very ancient. And we've communicated and lived alongside both the local Jewish populace as well as the Arabs and the Palestinians for many hundreds of years, and have figured out ways to communicate and even diplomatically live alongside them. But again, this conflict is kind of outside of we can't really stop it, nor should we even participate in it, because either way, it could spill out, it could even metastasize into something which we don't really want to be held accountable for here, because we're not actually in charge. So there are no Christians really in charge of Hamas. There aren't any Christians in charge of the IDF. So both sides don't really have any Christian guidance from the top. Both sides are, from our perspective, being guided by delusional ideologies. But nevertheless, I also wanted to mention the fact that the technology being used, right? So this is what makes this a bit different to maybe, say, the Donbass in 2014, right? When the Lugansk and Donetsk rebels stood up against Ukraine. Is because we're seeing these Hamas rebels as they captured the Israeli base. They simply, there are tanks standing there, armored vehicles, and they just begin burning them. So the tanks are being destroyed and not being utilized against the Israeli military, which makes me think that there's a high chance the Palestinian Hamas is simply not trained in the usage of tanks or some of these complex vehicles, which is, again, probably a sign that they won't be pushing out very far. Perhaps this conflict will actually end within 30 kilometers outside of Gaza. And the other thing is, there was really curious footage of an airbase next to Gaza, an Israeli airbase, where they were actually evacuating. Whoever the commander of the base was, began evacuating the jet fighters, because, of course, who would want a Palestinian behind, sitting in the seat of a jet fighter, flying it at Tel Aviv? I think that would be a pretty powerful image. But again, the Israelis were like, nah, we're not going to have any of that. So they evacuated all the jet fighter planes from all the airports around Gaza away from that particular area, which was at risk. So southern Israel, again, it's very much inflamed at the moment. But there is that consideration that, look, if the Palestinians do win out, and there is that chance, right, providentially, it could happen. We did speak about this in our episode about Heavenly Jerusalem. Even I think the Zionist Jews have this idea that there is a small chance, the Israeli regime is pushed into the Mediterranean and it stops existing. And so there is that consideration that, you have the Iron Dome, you have all these defense systems in place against the missiles, but if Israel does lose, we do have to consider, like, the Orthodox communities in the Holy Land will need to be living amongst Muslim rulers once again, just like in the olden days. And hopefully the Palestinians will be a bit more lenient towards us than, say, some of the Zionist masters who rule over the land now. So I guess there's that consideration that the Orthodox Christians there should simply sit back and maybe not participate too heavily and not get involved, because we're not sure exactly who will win. And it seems like, there's both sides are pretty inflamed and pretty, it's been a long time coming, let's just say. And of course, it's because the Zionist regime has essentially, as you said, Conrad, has essentially aimed to wipe out the Goyim, the residents of Gaza and the West Bank, and they do not view them as human, nor do they, it's just part of their, I guess, ideological extremism and their religious Satanism, that they don't exactly view their enemies as equal in terms of, like, human rights, or even as made in the image of God. So there's that consideration. So again, the fight is ongoing, and I guess it's a bit hard to say exactly who will win in the end, but diplomatically, this is again one more mark on the map for the Third World War, at least what seems to be as an emerging global conflict.
Yeah, and I think this is a great contrast I want to bring in. We talk about Russia, how this relates to the Russia-Turkey conflict, and I think Israel is going to be a key linchpin in that ultimately. And the Russian Foreign Ministry released a statement, said, "We call for an immediate ceasefire and a peace plan based on our support for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital." And Turkey said, Turkey is ready to help de-escalate the Israel-Palestine tensions and is in intense contacts with relevant parties to do so. Ankara strongly condemns the loss of civilian lives, calls on the parties to act with restraint and avoid impulsive steps. So as far as I can tell, Russia, similar statements, Russia seems to be possibly slightly leaning towards the Palestinians, as they are supporting, an expansion of their territory in the midst of what appears to be an aggression on their part. So of course, I think that actually aligns with their perspective on the special military operation. It would be, you mentioned Serbia as well. Look, Russia's thinking about this, they could perhaps view this as a Palestinian SMO to restore them to 1967 borders. And then we have Vucic coming out in total support of Israel, while Israel in 2020 recognized Kosovo. So, I mean, I guess that's a good enough, that could be a transition to ultimately talking about what's happening there, but we also have to talk about what's happening in Ukraine. So what's your situation, before we move on from this, what's your situation on the support front? Like, where's the line being drawn on the sides? It seems that, a lot of people are saying peace, but their statements indicate where they're slightly leaning one direction or the other.
Well, I think those countries which are very pro-Russia, I think, again, we see Saudi Arabia, Qatar formally speaking out in favor of in favor of Israel only. Oh, sorry, in favor of Palestine only because they do need to support that image of they are the holy places for the Muslim world. They're in the Hijaz, and they do need to paint this image of, look, we support the broader Arab world and the Islamic world. But of course, we know their main consideration is not for the Arabs, but probably for the money. And just not even for Islam. It's like the fact that they're huge and successful economic countries. We also see China, of course, India speaking out in favor of Israel. We see China very much sitting back, similar to Saudi Arabia, kind of not really taking a side, speaking out in favor of peace. For Russia, though, however, this will be, Russia really needs to, of course, it's taking a neutral stance, but Russia really does need to kind of throw a couple like winks in favor of Palestine, because in fact, actually splitting the attention of the Eye of Sauron to a different part on the global map does benefit Russia greatly, simply because, well, the powers that do support Israel, primarily the United States and NATO, you want to spread them thin. Exactly, you want their attention to be on multiple fronts around the world, in Northwest Africa, in Libya, in Mali, that ECOWAS territory, right? That's in the Sahel region. You want them to be focusing on various areas, not exactly on the Ukraine, which they have been, very, very much focusing on for the longest time now. So again, and we know the United States is the main contributor to Israeli defense, and of course the main donor to the Israeli budget, you could say, from abroad, simply giving them, was it $30 to $50 billion every single year in American dollars, which is absolutely insane. But that they've been doing that for the last, well, since Israel became a country, essentially. So it's very much curious. I think Russia understands that. President Putin understands that. So Russia cannot be pro-Israeli, but it does need to. Again, Israel does have a large Russian population. I think over 2 million, or I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating, but there is a very large number of Israelis who actually have Russian citizenship, so have dual citizenship. Netanyahu himself speaks perfect Russian, completely fluently. His Russian is better than his English. So a lot of Israelis are former Soviet/Russian Federation citizens, including people like Abramovich. So there is that clan consideration. Putin cannot simply say, we support Palestine, because there are people around him in the Kremlin who are literal Israeli citizens, including some of the richest people in Russia. If you look at the Forbes list, most of the Russians on that list are actually ethnically Jewish. And in fact, they are Russian citizens, but they're also Israeli citizens. There is that dual consideration. But at the same time, Putin and even Shoigu, I think, understand that they need the West to actually distract themselves on this Palestinian issue and kind of drop a bit of that heat off of the Ukrainian front, which, again, Putin has, as he stated in the Valdai speech, 557 tanks have been destroyed since June. And I mean, Russia is under a very stressful economic as well as military. It's very stressed right now. So it will be, I think, beneficial for there to be some international distraction. But nevertheless, I think we should move on to Serbia, because it does tie into the fact that Vucic, as you said, very much being, I guess, as we called him, the cuck of Kosovo. I think that nickname, he's very much sticking to it. And I think, yeah, there's definitely a lot has occurred in Serbia over the last 2 weeks and around the Kosovo region, which we simply cannot ignore.
Yeah, we had slightly, softened on it. We had withdrawn the cuck of Kosovo accusation briefly, but it's back. As we took a week off, of course, thank you for your patience. But during that week, of course, there was a huge escalation in the northern part of Kosovo and the, ethnically Serbian regions that are still, dominated by their historic ethno-religious group. And basically what happened was the news coverage at least started when a group of armed men, apparently Serbs, basically stormed the Banjska monastery in the northern region of Kosovo. And this led to a big standoff with Kosovar police. And multiple people on both sides were shot and killed. And now this has basically led to initially a big escalation. Vucic basically rattling the saber, threatening a actual operation. The head of the Serbian military said that if the president ordered it, we would move in to Kosovo. But of course, then when the U.S. slapped back, said we are considering, sanctioning Kosovo, the EU started considering it. Next thing you know, he started withdrawing the military buildup that had been happening for the past months. And they've basically reduced that from like over 14,000 military personnel to about 7,500, and the goal being eventually down to 4,000. So unfortunately, any buildup of a possible, special military operation for the liberation of at least the northern part of Kosovo has definitely been put into a major setback. And the narrative, again, the main narrative being that this was, Serbian nationalists, basically taking advantage of, there have been these protests, the Kurti has really been overstepping his boundaries with the Serb minority in those northern regions. And so there was apparently a patrol, I guess a civilian defense of some kind, or some sort of we've seen these before, people going around defending, because we've seen atrocities committed by the Kosovo police and others in the past. But basically a leader of the Serbian List Party, which is a Serbian nationalist party, in Serbia, it was caught in this armed group of people. However, the dispute comes over basically who shot first. Were the Kosovar police firing on who they perceived as overly armed Serbian militia in the northern part of Kosovo, or did the Kosovar Serbs, initiate it? I'm obviously inclined to believe the Serbs on this one and say that the Kosovo Albanians have increased, because this has only worked out for them, right? Like, this now makes the Serbs look like terrorists. And now Kurti, Kurti had been on the receiving end of all of the reprimands from the United States government up until this point, and now it's come full circle, and now Serbia is under the threat of sanction and everything, because Kosovo and the Albanian authorities had been brought under some form of sanctions as well, because Kurti was very much abusing the Serbian minority in the north to the point where the U.S. was noticing. So this is a big deal. Obviously, at this point, the monasteries, thankfully no pilgrims or monastics were injured, but in general, this is very much a big escalation on that front, and unfortunately, it has led to apparently a further militarization on the part of the Kosovar Albanian authorities, because now they've basically declared that whole region a counter-terrorist zone and are able to storm people's houses, and I'm sure some fairly unseemly actions are taking place.
Yeah, and I think the positive side of this, and if you can even call this positive, but it does show that the Serbian military is ready to essentially mobilize and take battle positions within essentially like a moment's notice, right? You can move 15,000 troops to the border of Serbia and Kosovo within 1 to 2 days, and essentially set up camp on essentially around half of the territory, essentially half of the border of Kosovo, and essentially threatened to invade, even begin a peacekeeping operation to defend the Orthodox Christians within Kosovo from any sort of aggression on the part of Kurdi or his government or any Albanian Muslim extremists, which they do exist from the Albanian side. So it's not just that the Serbians are the bad guys and the aggressors here. No, it's in fact that, and I'm just going to quote Viktor Orban, who stated very openly in a very pro-Serbian comment. He says the idea of sanctions being imposed on Serbia by the EU is impossible and absurd. The Albanians have been provoking the Serbs for 2 years. They must behave differently. Don't provoke the Serbs, which is true. Like this has been the as you mentioned, the status quo since the 1990s, you can say, and even 1999 specifically, where Serbia has been painted as the enemy and the Albanians have been painted as the victims of the Serbs, very explicitly in the area of Kosovo and even Albania proper. So in fact that the fact that Europe and even Central Europe, you can say Hungary, are the most, I guess you can say one of the most right-wing countries in Europe, is actually rising up and taking a personal stance. Viktor Orban, again, he's very much an oddball perhaps, but the fact that he's speaking out in favor of Serbia, and considering Austro-Hungarian Serbian history, curiously enough, it does paint a very positive picture that, look, Serbia can mobilize, and Serbia could potentially in the future even have original Western, if not Central European support for some of its actions. Not going to go that far and say that it would have total support for any actions or special military operations in Kosovo, but the fact that Vucic was weak and he couldn't take the final steps, he couldn't do what, and I mean Medvedev was weak and during the Georgian 2008 conflict as well. But so it's just the fact that leaders can be weak and they don't have that willpower in order to execute certain decisions. That's very much clear. But at least the threat was there. Serbia has essentially shown its fangs that, look, it's possible that we can bite back. We're not just going to take a beating from the Albanians or be provoked by by essentially this fake state of Kosovo into submission. Like Serbia does have some ability to strike back at its abusers. So I think that's probably a generally a positive note. I think, despite the fact that Vucic again shows not just in his support for the state of Israel, despite the fact that Israel does recognize Kosovo as a legitimate sovereign state, and for again supporting Zelensky, all this bizarre stuff, Vucic is definitely probably representative of a certain portion of Serbian elites. But there is, I think, a really, you could say, based and red-pilled, very conservative Serbian elite still existing somewhere, and I suppose that we could see that in the representatives of the Bosnian Republika Srpska, but probably in Serbia proper there is that elite as well there, and their representative, they are pressuring Vucic to make some of these, I mean, you could say awesome moves, which what we saw a week and a half ago, him surrounding Kosovo and almost sending in the forces.
Yeah, and just an update on what I said before, Milan Radicic, who was the leader of the Serbalist party I mentioned, he was arrested in Serbia, but then immediately released, although he did have his passport confiscated and is banned from entering the territory of Kosovo and Metohija. So that's sort of the situation there. Yeah, the Serbs that were involved, they basically fled to that monastery and then were, engaged in firefights with the Kosovar police, but they had basically a large armored vehicle, almost like a tank with a mounted gun, pretty serious weaponry. So it was, it was a serious little firefight that went on there. And you mentioned the other conflicts, Srpska. I mean, there's an amazing video of Patriarch Porphyry. He visited Srpska and Dodik and walked around the beautiful city of Mostar, which I think is probably the most iconic city in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It has the huge Mostar Bridge that people jump off of that was, supposedly destroyed by Slobodan Praljak, the Croatian, who you've all seen the video of him drinking poison and killing himself in front of The Hague. That's the bridge that, he blew up, and he was, going to be sentenced to prison for the rest of his life during the war there. But Patriarch Porphyry and, the Metropolitan of Montenegro, Joanna Kai, they very much seem to be not necessarily pushing for a war or conflict, but they are very much standing firm, more so even than the president of Serbia, with, the Serbian people and the people that are being forced to, in some way, shape, or form, whether it's in Srpska, having their leader threatened with arrest by a Muslim government, or being in Kosovo, where their people are now being treated like terrorists by a Muslim government. It's very much another civilizational front in the World War Now universe, the ongoing world of World War III. But unless you have anything that has to go on in that world, we should probably get to Ukraine and some of what Putin said at Valdai, because there was some very big news, and the Black Sea has been very active, to say the least.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'll say is that during that time in the 1990s, Patriarch Paul or Pavel of Serbia actually spoke out against Serbia formally continuing the war in Kosovo. He said that, look, Serbia should not, and even I think threatened some of the Serbian commanders of excommunication if they did enter into Kosovo. So, in fact, there was that side of the church that, in fact, really wanted peace no matter what in that particular conflict. And I guess not saying the Patriarch was wrong, but at the time, there was that spiritual discernment that Serbia was very much so stressed out in the 90s that all that was needed was peace, besides even more fragmentation from taking place. But again, that's probably more of a historical lesson and more like historical analysis that needs to take place there. But analogous to that was 1993. In fact, it was the 30-year anniversary of that event when the White House, this is moving back into more Eastern European territory, the White House in Russia was essentially bombed by the Yeltsin government in the Moscow coup of October 1993. And I remember very vividly reading in the news that Patriarch Alexei II actually said that whoever spills blood in this day in October 1993 will be excommunicated from the church. So in order to prevent a civil war in Russia, the Patriarch Alexei II openly stated that he will be excommunicating anybody who will spill Russian blood in those unholy days when Yeltsin actually took over the Soviet Union and completely dismantled it by forcefully attacking the Soviet parliament in the White House, which a lot of Russian nationalists and even Orthodox nationalists were defending that White House, but Yeltsin brought tanks into Moscow. So that was the 30-year anniversary. It wasn't really remembered in Russia, but those are some pretty dark days in the past. Nevertheless, those are the interesting opinions we see from clergymen, which frankly maybe we don't even see today these days, this sort of really hard stance against military conflict where it's just there's a threat of excommunication coming from top down that if anybody participates. In fact, we did see, we mentioned in one of our episodes, Father George Maximov actually openly stated that any Ukrainians actually fighting against Russia are recommended that they actually submit and surrender to the Russian forces, and they shouldn't be fighting against their Orthodox brothers in Russia. So there's been open calls from the Russian church for Ukrainian soldiers to be surrendering because it's a sin actually to fight alongside persecutors of Christianity against your Christian brothers. So that's kind of the opinion coming from the Russian side. But moving to the Valdai, right, Conrad? I think what's interesting is, and we both watched this particular speech of Putin, but Putin essentially for almost 3.5 hours speaks to a Russian audience, essentially of for foreign correspondents as well as local members of the Valdai geopolitical club. And there's a lot of things that were essentially quite striking. I think the general message of multipolarity being the goal of essentially Russian foreign policy was stated. Also, again, the restated objectives of the Ukrainian conflict were given by Putin, which, again, underlines what me and Conrad were speaking about, that the objectives are a bit watered down. We don't see much mention of the persecution on the church in Ukraine and the Russia actually stopping that persecution as being a goal. And Putin doubled down on that, and he just said, look, the objective is denazification. He mentioned it at least 3 times in the 2.5 hours of Q&A, as well as his opening statement. He mentioned the fact that, well, look, Ukraine essentially wants to join NATO, and look, Russia even wanted to join NATO at one point or another. So he went a bit light on the whole NATO angle, which was very surprising. He actually spoke favorably in terms of NATO, and he said, look, NATO is simply following its own interests, and Russia has its own multipolar interests in the world. And then, there were these quite explicit statements. I think this is probably the most negative side, right? I don't want to paint the entire Valdai presentation of Putin as negative because generally speaking, it was quite good. The multipolarity talks, very patriotic, his opinion on the Ukrainian SMO. There is no talk of peace treaties here or any sort of disgraceful surrenders of the Russian side, which, I don't think anybody wants that, at least not on the multipolarity end. Maybe if you're a supporter of the Western New World Order, you would be kind of in support of Russia surrendering, but Putin did not give any of that energy. But he did mention something which a lot of Russians found somewhat offensive, including Oleg Tsaryov, Paul Gubaryov, and I'm sure Strelkov as well. If he had the capacity from prison, he would probably comment on this very thing quite explicitly. But Putin, at the end of his presentation, and mind you, it's at the end, so it's about 3.5 hours in, Putin's quite tired at this point. He's asked about the plane crash in Tver on 24th of August 2023 when Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, and as well as the stewardess, the pilot, and some of the other Wagner military group officials have passed away in that accident. Why did the plane fall? And Putin says, well, the forensic chief actually informed me that they found fragments of grenades. So that when the grenades explode, you have those shrapnel fragments in the bodies of the deceased. And then he says, well, I'm tying this to the fact that they found 5 kilograms of cocaine at Prigozhin's house in St. Petersburg. And in my opinion, says Putin, I think they should have had a alcohol and drug test, at least tested the bodies of the deceased for maybe they were under the influence of narcotics and substances. So Putin said, and then he says, I'm not really an expert, but one more thing. Putin just says, look, the planes weren't tampered with externally. So he says the planes weren't sabotaged. There was no bombs. The plane essentially exploded through. It appears to be Putin's trying to say that Prigozhin, Utkin, the stewardess, they were playing around with grenades while being high on drugs. Really, like a 4-time hero of Russia, as well as multiple other. I mean, Prigozhin maybe Prigozhin was actually on cocaine, but to think that the Dmitry Utkin, as well as some of the other officials, were actually taking narcotics on this plane from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and they blew themselves up with a grenade. I mean, it's a very strange thing it's very strange for him to say that, because a lot of Russians found that incredibly offensive, given that it is 40 days since their death in the Orthodox Church, and they were all Orthodox, the majority of those who passed on that plane. So it's a very kind of solemn time. And then Putin just comes out with this kind of a rude remark. It's almost as if the personal gripes between him and the Wagner group for the 24th of June is still very active. And again, it points the spotlight of the assassination of Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin and the Wagner officials as something that perhaps is an internal Russian assassination. Like, who is in charge? Was it Shoigu? There have been different suggestions thrown around, and I think the spotlight, again, it's not on the CIA, it's not on French intelligence, it's not on the Mossad, it's not even on Ukrainians at this point, it's not even on the SBU. It's like, well, who inside of Russia organized this horrendous assassination attempt? The spotlight is back on the Kremlin. And I'm not saying it's Putin in particular, but there's definitely some people inside who really wanted Prigozhin and Utkin dead, and they succeeded. At this point, nobody's been prosecuted, and this still remains one of the most mysterious things. So that's probably the negative side. But yeah, there's some interesting comments about Ukrainian cities as well that transpired.
Yeah, this is the first time Putin referred to Odessa as a Russian city, which, again, we've been commenting on the slow rhetorical shift towards Odessa being part of the special military operations zone, for a long time now, and it seems that that's becoming real. Obviously, the strikes on the Odessa region and the ports there are increasing. And in general, I mean, Scott Ritter recently said this, that there's sort of a consensus developing that Mykolaiv, Odessa region, Sumy, Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov regions are about to be on the menu. And, that's probably what we might be seeing come February, when Russia decides to really push back once the Ukrainian counteroffensive is, dead and gone and completely demilitarized. But when it comes to some of the speech and the Prigozhin situation, it's Putin, maybe he really was just kind of speaking off the cuff and tired. It would make sense after that long of a talk. But, it's still very mysterious that, this is, it's back in the spotlight with these comments. So people had really forgotten, obviously the Russian forces don't try to make a big deal out of these sorts of things necessarily. If it was an operation, obviously they'd try to, quickly sweep it under the rug. But yeah, whether it was this or not, there obviously is internal power disputes within the Russian, special military operation, within the Russian government. But at the same time, we can never fully dismiss, the 4D chess arguments and some of these things, because remember, Surovikin, we thought that his new air defense CIS position, he was totally out of the picture, but he was spotted semi-recently in Moscow, leaving a church, asked about his position, and he said he couldn't say, that he was just serving the fatherland. So there's a lot of very interesting things going on. I stand by, there's still a 1% chance they take Kiev, and then suddenly we see on our TVs Africa coup style, Surovikin reading a paper with Prigozhin and Utkin standing behind him, in Wagner gear. Who knows? I would say crazier things have happened, but I'm not so sure. But I mean, as far as the rest of the situation going on in Ukraine, probably the biggest news is that Russia has relocated the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk and Feodosia, which are basically on the east side of Crimea as opposed to the west, the main deep water port of Sevastopol, which is, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. We, of course, saw the actual headquarters on land of the fleet, of the admirals and whatnot, destroyed by Ukrainian airstrikes. Of course, the admirals didn't actually meet there at this point. It's a peacetime / more symbolic location, but that, really did happen. And I think the ships have been taking more damage from these intense sort of going for broke drone attacks from the Ukrainians. So this was a strategic move. They're not all the way over in Kerch or anything, so now it's not gonna motivate more attacks on the Kerch bridge per se, but they're much more eastwards than they were in Sevastopol. So it seems that, they are trying to preserve the fleet, perhaps for that eventual, sea invasion of the Odessa and Mykolaiv regions, and even the other regions down by Romania. So big things happening. Of course, the Ukrainian counteroffensive completely failing, no territorial gains. Russia is actually gaining territory in multiple directions. Ukraine has continued and increased attacks now on Belgorod, doing the more terroristic things. But in general, Ukraine is very much slowly but surely turning into just a loss for the West. And it seems that, again, this Israel thing could be an opportunity for them to revitalize their foreign policy image on a winning team, because there's, again, the Hamas and Palestinians are fighting an uphill battle.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, as we know, the ties between Israel and Ukraine are pretty close. Of course, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has spoken out in favor of Israel. So in terms of who's choosing what side, Zelensky has in fact chosen the Israeli side, much to our surprise. But very interesting, two sets of statistics that have come out. Of course, President Putin officially has given us the statistics of the special military operation, or not just the military operation, but the Ukrainian counteroffensive. He says that, so Ukraine, since the 4th of June, have lost 557 tanks. Just keep that in mind. 557 tanks since June. And he says they also lost 1,900 armored vehicles of various classes and sizes. I mean, enormous amounts of armor, enormous, like billions of taxpayer dollars wasted by the Ukrainian military on what? On Zaporozhye, and what is it, like 20 kilometers worth of territory gained in the Donetsk Oblast as well as Zaporozhye only? Like almost nothing. It's a failed counteroffensive. I think we can openly come to these conclusions now that we're 3 months removed. Essentially all of summer was wasted on essentially this Ukrainian failure of an operation, which, much to our delight, I think, mostly because, again, this is all a very degenerate scheme which Zelensky is throwing around here in the Ukraine. So Putin gives us that statistic, and he says also that at least 90,000 Ukrainians have either lost their lives or have been irreparably removed from any ability to fight. So essentially either, with their limbs amputated or being hurt so badly that they simply cannot return to combat. So close to, he says 90,000, that's the figure that Putin gives officially at the Valdai speech. So again, I don't have any reason to doubt these statistics and numbers, but yeah, heavy losses since June, I would say. Very bloody summer in Zaporozhye and Donetsk, especially for the Ukrainian side, and a bit less so on the Russians, because the Russians were on the defense this entire time, ever since Bakhmut fell. And so the defense, as we know in warfare, generally always has the advantage, and the Russians definitely have used this advantage to the fullest extent. Another set of statistics very interesting from the Ukrainian SBU. So the Ukrainian FBI/CIA equivalent has released an open statement that, look, they have 68 criminal cases open against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And they're kind of flexing in a way. This is almost like an Antichrist type brief that they're releasing. This says 68 cases, and 14 of them are against Ukrainian Orthodox metropolitans. So imagine, metropolitans in the Russian church are even higher ranking than archbishops. So if you're a Greek, you may think, well, metropolitans are pretty high, but archbishops are high. In the Russian church, metropolitans are considered the highest rank in the church behind the patriarch. So this is 14 metropolitans are being investigated by the Ukrainian feds, which is insane. And they also released other statistics. They said, well, 19 clergymen have been already found of criminal anti-Ukrainian activities, and 19 other clergymen have lost their Ukrainian citizenship. So these are clergymen like Bishop Luke of Zaporozhye, right, Metropolitan Luke, who have in fact ended up in Melitopol, which is controlled by Russia, and he cannot return to the actual Zaporozhye city and his diocese. And the Ukraine, I think, has in fact relinquished his Ukrainian citizenship because they believe he's somehow cooperating with the Russian SMO soldiers, which in fact he really hasn't been doing. All he's been doing is administering his diocese, like his diocesan affairs. He hasn't been involved in military at all. So very, very curious and on that end. So Ukraine has in fact openly given statistics. I'm not sure for whom these statistics are, right? So who exactly are the consumers of this information? Is this supposed to... The fact that they're releasing statistics of persecution so openly makes me think that, well, on one hand, they're sure that Russia won't be using this as propaganda. On the other hand, there are definitely internal consumers who this is supposed to bolster their I guess, morale of some sort. Like it is very curious and it's somewhat diabolical. Like the reaction to this from the Russian side needs to be a lot stronger. This needs to be used as, I want to say, righteous propaganda of sorts. Because definitely Imperial Russia would not allow this to happen. If Austria-Hungary did something similar back pre-World War One, the Russian Empire, Nicholas II, or even Alexander III would have declared war on Austria-Hungary, or at least would have threatened with war. So you have to keep in mind, Orthodox foreign policy is very, very much always on the defensive side. But whenever there's persecution happening adjacent to a major Orthodox power, the Orthodox Empire has to act to defend their own. And this is not really happening here. And again, the Russian Federation is not an Orthodox empire yet, but we're still in that sort of novice adept zone where they have to kind of rise up to the occasion. And this is perhaps that occasion. But we've been speaking about this for a little while. That's just our futuristic, hypothetical, not really even futuristic, but in fact, the fact that it will transpire, and we're simply looking for some of those early glimpses of those future prophecies actually coming to pass.
Yeah, and on that front, I mean, at this point, a bill in the Ukrainian Rada has achieved the 226 necessary signatures from people's deputies for a bill that will entirely ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to be voted on in the near future. So that's the sort of thing we're working with there. You know, they're begging for weapons. They're, you know, drafting and conscripting teenagers and old men, and they think, you know, we're losing this war completely. Let's just completely declare war on God as well, as if they hadn't already. But it really does seem that, you know, this state is destined for total destruction, for better or for worse. And again, that ties into the new heavenly Jerusalem. Again, we know Putin, you know, there's a large Zionist lobby in Russia. And if this really does go a certain way, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, depending on how much territory had been taken, Putin decided to let a certain number of Israelis come and settle some of these now war-torn regions. Is that a stretch, Dimitri?
No, I think it's definitely a possibility. We just need to be aware of it. We need to be very sober and vigilant and not have any rose-tinted glasses on, because that's essentially what all the saints say, right? Don't be under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or propaganda of any side, frankly. And even if you think me and Conrad's words are propaganda, you know, go and wash your face or listen to somebody else, because in fact we advise you seek out, if you're really concerned about the information we provide, seek out objective sources elsewhere, because we're simply giving you kind of the facts, but also we're giving you a more or less biased Orthodox Christian opinion. But definitely I think it's far from propaganda. And in fact, I would say, you know, always speak to your local priest in terms of finding out, like filter all the information through them, through your spiritual fathers, confessors. Never just take any words you hear online, or even from us or anybody for that matter, or even in the books you read. Never take it as sort of as gospel, so to speak. No pun intended, right? Because of course, and read Holy Scripture, and of course read your Orthodox Study Bible, and just measure everything up against that. And that's always the recommendation, I think. But nevertheless, the heavenly Jerusalem thesis,
as a wise man once told me, everyone really should only be reading books with the word ST in front of the author's name.
Absolutely. And the heavenly Jerusalem thesis, which we laid out, is not even our theory. It's in fact the theory which has existed amongst the Jewish community in Ukraine itself, in Israel. The Israeli oligarchs have been speaking about it internally, and the only reason we know about it is because members of the Jewish community have openly, verbally confirmed it through people like Zhirinovsky in Russia, through people like former Rabbi Edward Hodos, who is now an Orthodox Christian. You can go find that episode that we've spoken about very explicitly, and I mean, it's the uncensored episode on A4 Hours, so I think it's already kind of on the table. We may even come to explore it later on. We do have some more very spicy Ukrainian episodes coming around regarding the territory of Ukraine and those particular groups of people and them boys and how they interact in this particular area historically, and some of the backstory, because again, there's definitely a lot of lore to be spoken about here historically, just about that particular culture which existed in this particular land. But nevertheless, this Israeli connection, I mean, it's very evident. Israel is at risk of destruction by the Arabic groups surrounding them. It's just the fact that, look, it seems like the enemies of Israel simply cannot coordinate themselves. And this is why, Conrad, you mentioned on previous episodes that Egypt is in fact their big recipient of US aid, because the Egyptian Arabs need to be kept asleep so they do not strike against their northern ideological enemy. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Egypt, of course, having one of the most powerful militaries in the region, having a very large population, being very wealthy in many ways, being both a large African power, having access to the Red Sea, as well as very valuable resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. The U.S. has basically had to pay Egypt off to not fully destroy Israel. With, of course, they would then be aided by the Palestinian groups, Iran, forces in Lebanon. Apparently, even there's Jordanians that are willing to support the Palestinians here. So, yeah, Egypt has basically been bought off with the Golem bucks that the U.S. shells out at the behest of Israel. And I mean, of course, Egypt did get the Sinai Peninsula back, which I think has generally fared better for the monks and monastics at St. Catherine's Monastery. Of course, the ISIS scare probably spooked them a little bit, but we know who was behind that, of course, Israel and the United States. So, of course, Egypt, you know, has prepared certain, I believe, in the midst of all of this, they've talked about being very against a potential ground invasion of Gaza, which the Israeli authorities have said is very much on the table. So again, Egypt, they have a pretty big incentive to not get involved because of the big bucks flowing from the United States. But again, they are still a Muslim country. They are still allied with a lot of countries that are involved in the whole multipolarity project. And, their decision is going to be one of the key factors to how successful any kind of Palestinian resistance to Zionism can be.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's again, you see the mammon does control many forces in the world. Like the influence of money is really powerful. Not just in Ukraine. It does seem like it's almost boring because nobody really wants to dwell on economics for too much. But even Putin, like Putin was asked, why exactly does Russia still allow for gas to be transited through Ukraine to power Ukrainian factories and essentially fuel Ukrainian vehicles, which then drive over to kill Russian soldiers? And Putin said, well, it's because that gas transits through Ukraine, but it goes into Europe. That's its final destination, and the Europeans pay us for the gas. And he says they're our contractual partners. We need to keep our agreements, and we need to receive that money. So that was Putin's answer. And he says that, look, Russia needs to transit gas for Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine siphons that gas, siphons that fuel, and uses it to fuel its own weapons and its own machine, which then pushes towards the Russian side and attempts to kill Russian soldiers. And, many people have been asking this question, why exactly doesn't Russia just simply destroy all the bridges over the Dnieper, just annihilate any Ukrainian gas, like simply close the valves and have the country essentially lose all of its electricity overnight and all of its power, all of its water, and end the conflict in maybe 3-4 months tops. But in fact, it's not happening because of money. And I'm not saying that Putin's wrong with his economic consideration. Possibly he is, very, very possibly, similar to his comments about Prigozhin, inappropriate. But here, at least, he was transparent and he openly said that, look, we have contractual partners in Europe and we are keeping those agreements alive. And again, the Valdai speech, for all of its positive sides where he speaks out in favor of multipolarity, and he actually paints a very light picture for the future of the world. He even says the United Nations has outlived its use. In fact, the only reason the United Nations and the Security Council are relevant today is because there is no alternative. And he says that eventually the United Nations and this globalist project will be doomed to failure, which is great. So it's good that Russia has this vision for the future, and it looks like India and China are really very much for that as well. Various civilizations acting in their own interests around the world. I mean, that's a positive thing for, I think, all Christians and all people who, all these independent civilizations at once. But there's also that consideration that, look, Putin still sees Russia as somewhat adjacent to this Western degenerate culture, which is why he called the United States partners again, almost 2 or 3 times throughout the entire 3-hour interview. And again, verbally people can make mistakes, but we can't help but notice these things. And it should be mentioned that, well, Russia's maybe there is this vision within the Kremlin that there is still a way out, despite all of my comments as well. Maybe there is this like, well, what if we take the left bank of the Dnieper, which is technically speaking, when you say left bank of the Dnieper, you're talking about everything to the right of Kiev. So to the right side of the Dnieper, technically, even though it's called the left bank. So left bank Ukraine becomes Russian, and then the peace treaty is signed, and then, essentially Russia becomes European again. And European means, slow creep of liberal values, nothing really changes over time, which is kind of what we all want to avoid anyway. But, I mean, that's just a long-term prognosis, and perhaps, hopefully it won't transpire, and hopefully we'll see some sort of, orthodox resurgence in Russia, not this dependence on European fiat currency, which seems to be like that's the main fuel in all of this, right? Saudi Arabia cares about the money, Qatar as well. Yeah, they comment about Arabic and Islamic independence and Arabic Islamic rights in Palestine, but we all know Saudi Arabia and Donald Trump's presidency, when Donald Trump literally gave Golan Heights to Israel, and Saudi Arabia were quiet about that because, well, Donald Trump had the greatest $1 billion deal signed with Saudi Arabia since the Lend-Lease of World War II. So, I mean, money does still run affairs in the world, and that's the domain of the devil. We just have to keep that in mind.
I mean, yeah, I mean, this whole the whole Israel question. I mean, it wouldn't be as relevant if the tentacles of Israel weren't in every major institution around the world, and that, of course, involves money. I mean, it's these are the money changers whose tables Christ turned over. They've had a state now for over 70 years, so of course it's going to cause a lot of disruption, sort of in the region. But I kind of want to bring in a new, we're not getting close on time necessarily, but I want to bring in a new element here to cover our main other front, and it really just relates to everything. Turkey is, of course, distracting Syria, which is being helpful to Israel right now. But of course, this all comes in the midst of the more recent, war that came and went, the Armenia-Azerbaijan Karabakh War, where Azerbaijan has now completely reclaimed all of its internationally recognized territory to the unfortunate reality of the Armenian people living there. We've had, tens of thousands of Armenians have fled the former Republic of Artsakh, returning back to Armenia. There's reports of ethnic cleansing, of course. I have seen some unfortunate videos of, Azeri soldiers just unloading their AK clips into crosses set up along the roads and whatnot. So it is an unfortunate reality to see. But as this kind of whole Israel thing spills over into, the World War III question, Iran, I mentioned they're not close to Israel's border, but they are close to Azerbaijan, one of Israel's main allies. So, depending on if Iran really, really wanted to put the heat onto Israel, they could, take a hammer to Azerbaijan and disrupt a lot of their energy reliance and just the things they get from Azerbaijan. And of course, this comes amidst Azerbaijan's pledge that they may be about to recognize Northern Cyprus as an independent country, which they would basically be the first country to do that. And of course, they're Turkey's number one ally, and they would do such a thing. And so, obviously, this kind of brings into, what if in a broad spectrum, Israel ends up doing the same thing, and to kind of win Turkey to its side as one of the main Muslim countries that wouldn't be, perhaps against them, as Turkey is a bit divorced from some of the Iranian, Saudi, more serious religious stuff. Turkey is not the wise elder of the global Muslim family. They're the big secular power. So the allegiances of each of these countries breaking down on the Israel question is going to be interesting. But I could very much see how. I mean, look, if they recognize Northern Cyprus and Israel does that, I mean, the Greeks already don't love Israel, but they would they would make their voices heard in that regard, to say the least.
Yeah, of course, we still need to consider the fact that Azerbaijan is that link between, say, Israel and the Turkic world, which is very interesting because there are rumors, of course, that the president of Azerbaijan is in fact half Jewish, or at least that his mother is a Jewish Azeri mix. So in fact, there are these covert connections, and we know that the Jewish community in the Soviet Union, where Aliyev was born, was in fact very, very heavily integrated in various elites. For example, Brezhnev's wife was a Jew. Various very powerful figures had either Jewish spouses or had Jewish familial connections. It's not like they had to be necessarily members of the Hasidic Jewish community themselves, but simply being related to that particular community gave them even diplomatic ties to Israel, which is why literally half the Knesset can speak Russian at the moment. So the Israeli parliament, everybody including Netanyahu, who we mentioned earlier, can speak fluent Russian. There's familial connections, and in fact that may be very much active in Azerbaijan. And look, Azerbaijan's main enemy at the moment, Armenia, it doesn't really leave much to be appreciated, especially given the fact that they democratically, you could say, not that we're fans of democracy, but they seem to be in support of Pashinyan, or at least they were for the last few years, almost a decade. They voted him in multiple times, and in fact, Pashinyan seems to be a complete turncoat. So in terms of Vucic being bad, Pashinyan is a complete clown. This man has completely lost all credibility, right? So Pashinyan in 2020 visited Lukashenko when Lukashenko won that COVID election, right? And had those, remember, Belarus had those public protestings and beatings and things like that. And there was an unelected democratic liberal, like a fake president who was announced in the West, and she lived in Poland, Tikhanovskaya. Well, Pashinyan 2 days ago visited Tikhanovskaya in Granada and actually congratulated her, said that, look, Pashinyan's having a holiday in Spain with his wife, who recently went to Kiev to speak to Zelensky and Zelensky's wife, and now Pashinyan's hanging out with a fake Belarusian president in Spain, of all places, like the western of most Western Europe's, of the worst birth rate in Europe possible. Like, I'm not saying Spain is like a bad place, but nevertheless, it's like the peak of European degradation, you could say. And it's just very symbolic. The fact that Pashinyan, this turncoat, betrays his own people, betrays any sort of international alliances, betrays his friendship with Russia. Just his rhetoric is just very horrible, and even his actions are worse. And it's just very curious that Aliyev seems to be this like Giga Chad, almost this brave, heroic figure compared to him, which is sad because Aliyev is, for all intents and purposes, doesn't seem to be a good man. In fact, he definitely has, as you mentioned, Conrad, his own interests, and those interests don't exactly align with those of, say, Greece and even Orthodox countries such as Russia. And Putin admitted so in his Valdai speech, where Putin says specifically, he said that, look, whatever happens in Karabakh now, there are no Armenians left. Putin said there's, 2,000 Armenians left in Karabakh, 150,000 left, and he says it's Pashinyan's fault. Putin put all of the blame on actual Pashinyan himself and on the Armenian leadership for not organizing a proper transition of the region to Azeri power. And Putin said that, look, that's simply the case. It's not Russia's responsibility to look after these regions. It's Pashinyan's particular fault that all these tragedies transpired. And so I think it's definitely very interesting, Putin's particular opinion on the Armenian-Azeri conflict.
Well, Putin recently just said that the Russian Federation has been offering Armenia for 15 years a compromise in return of 5 territories of Karabakh to Azerbaijan and 2 to Armenia. So I guess there's 7 constituent parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, and they were willing to give, I guess, probably I would assume the 2 most Armenian regions to Armenia, and then some of the more mixed regions to Azerbaijan. And I guess whether at one point that was Armenian nationalism refusing that quickly turned into Pashinyan's snakiness, just rejecting that as a pretext for just completely throwing Russia to the side, destroying the CSTO, and just abandoning your people and God and just everything. He is a shame on his people, and the fact that someone like Gaddafi gets treated one way and someone like him gets treated a certain way, it's a tragedy. But as far as the situation broadly goes, not to keep bringing, again, the situation is live in Israel and everything, so we're going to be continuing to keep everybody updated with it. Clashes continue in the West Bank. There's all sorts of people on Twitter and X are commenting on all of this. We've seen Jordan Peterson say, "Give them hell, Netanyahu." We're, of course, seeing everybody's favorite based and epic, Bapsphere people, like Zero, H.P. Lovecraft, beloved acolyte of Costin Alamariu, talking about stuff like, how can you support these, brown invaders against a first world European country? And it's like, okay, like, to engage in this, suddenly we're pro-Israel because we're racist. I don't really understand. I don't understand the logic. I mean, that doesn't. Or read your 20th century history. These things break down a certain way. But I think this relates to what we recently saw with Elon Musk and the meteoric rise of ban the ADL, and then its unfortunate, I don't want to say collapse or failure, but the Jewish side of that struggle really clapped back hard. They brought Elon into a space with Ben Shapiro, Alan Dershowitz, the former president of Israel, and then like 6 or 7 high-level rabbis, the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the head of the Auschwitz Museum, the head of the International Council on Holocaust Denial, the head of like the Council of German Jews, whatever that is. All of these, ZOA, Organizations of America, basically just major institutions of world Jewry that generally align more on the right end of the spectrum, explicitly Zionist, not so much culturally left-wing like the ADL. They basically brought Elon in and hit him with a very, very kosher struggle session. And, they were trying to get him to come to Auschwitz. He finally gave a tentative yes to one of the rabbis demanding that he come to Auschwitz. And Elon was, he was making a show of it. He was shucking and jiving. And, he was talking about how he has more Jewish friends than non-Jewish friends, about how he hopes that all the Jewish people he knows have at least 3 children and all this stuff. And of course, I think he's being fairly neutral on the Israel-Palestine question, and everyone's wondering, how much of this is a game he's playing. He was going pretty hard on the ADL only for, more and more people to get banned, like the free speech situation itself only got worse. However, Nick Fuentes on his Autumn Groiper account has been allowed to stay alive for a while now, so maybe that's something subtle happening, but either way, the fact that this just went down and now Israel is, in a state of war, it's very interesting to say the least. Of course, all the people on the right, even the people in the more dissident sphere, they're being reined back in to the Zionist spectrum because the big donors, the benefactors, the movers and shakers, they've called in the support. So everyone from Jack Posobiec, to Ben Shapiro, I'm sure Donald Trump will be commenting on this. I wish he would, continue to, I don't know, maybe he won't. Maybe he'll hold that grudge against Netanyahu for congratulating Biden. But of course, Biden has himself, come out in support of Israel. So yeah, it's a big thing. But we are going to have to. It's not to say that there's a vested American interest in completely rooting for a Palestinian victory or anything. But from the Christian perspective, I think in many ways the Zionist Authority has had its time and has not proven itself a steward of the Christian Holy Land, to say the least. So we're watching this very closely, but the American situation, this is going to very much be used to boost the Zionist lobby here in the States, which Israel definitely needs. Even if, Russia's has to be neutral on the question, Iran is rising, multipolarity is rising. Of course, the China connection, China, is moving more towards Iran than Israel. So Israel needs to boost its support from the U.S. pretty quick here. And, they're probably going to do it.
Yeah, I think this public shaming of Elon Musk was very telling, especially you look at some of the participants. Essentially, you had certain rabbis who were completely unknown, or even like heralds of certain, not heralds, but caretakers of various Jewish museums around the world who simply had almost no followers. Even on Twitter, you had people with 900 followers, not 900, small number, but, essentially unknown folks speaking to the richest man alive, essentially educating him top down about how he should respect a certain people's history, which is very bizarre. It's almost like they somehow took him to school again. And again, we see even the former president, out of the 12 people they elected alongside Ben Shapiro to kind of give this presentation, you have the famous American lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, of course, one of the best defense attorneys in, I guess in modern American history. But you also had the former president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, and of course, as we understand, Shoigu's mother's name was also Rivlin. Not that I make that connection, I kind of make it in jest, but that should be considered. We did speak about the Israeli lobby in Russia, but seems to be that the former president of Israel does have the same last name as Shoigu's mother, which I'm not sure if there's any, we can probably dig into that a bit later. But nevertheless, the shaming of Elon Musk was very much on the nose. Very interestingly enough, they did the shaming of the Canadian Parliament also took place, right, Conrad? When there was this weird Zelensky visit to the Canadian Parliament about 1.5 weeks ago, where he actually, and I'm not sure who this was an embarrassment of, because again, they rolled out this 97-year-old Ukrainian immigrant into Canada who was allegedly in Galicia, SS Galicia, when he was 18, 19, which was essentially a stormtrooper, I guess you can say, SS Nazi brigade created on the occupied territories of Western Ukraine by the Third Reich to essentially exterminate various unwanted groups and to fight various Ukrainian Russian guerrillas. And so this former member of a Nazi SS battalion was rolled out in the Canadian Parliament, and everybody gave an applause. Putin commented on this and said, "Well, can you believe this?" says Putin. He says, "Zelensky, a Jew, suddenly clapped for someone who committed the Holocaust. Did he not think that? What does that suggest? That he says, does he not? Maybe Zelensky is suggesting that SS Galicia never rounded up and shot Jews. Is he suggesting that the Holocaust didn't happen?" And then there was a silence. And then Putin says, "That's crazy. That's just really bad." And it's just a very bizarre comment that Putin made. Again, this Valdai speech, very interesting, but it does speak to the fact that whatever's happening in Western Europe is complete delusion, and the mixing of, on one hand, very pro-Israeli sentiments, on the other hand, this bizarre support for the Banderite regime, which is a very warped view of this anti-Russian neo-Nazi, I guess, ideology, which again, it's very active in Ukraine, but it seems that it's been even active in the Ukrainian immigration. And in fact, it's, if anything, right, Conrad, it's a replacement for the Orthodox culture and Orthodox faith for those Western Ukrainian immigrants, because it's like, well, what do you even focus your immigration life on? It's, well, your connection to, I don't know, the Third Reich, or your anti-Russianness, or your Banderism, which, again, this is all very much anti-Russian and just bizarre degeneracy. But what happened in the Canadian Parliament, again, the Speaker resigned. It was just a very strange show. From my perspective, and I almost wanted to ask Father John Whiteford in our interview about this, specifically, what if that 97-year-old former neo-Nazi, what if he actually confessed, and maybe he was even a member of the Orthodox Church, who knows, given that he was a Ukrainian? I mean, what happened in those particular regions in the 1940s? That was a long time ago, and he probably did commit crimes, given that he was a young man in the SS Galicia, right, the stormtrooper battalion. But is it possible for even a Nazi to kind of confess and to be forgiven of his sins? I'd say yes, of course, right? We Orthodox people believe that anybody, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Adolf Hitler, anybody could, of course, confess and be cleansed, and of course, receive salvation. So it does bring this moral question into play. Like, in the Western world, is there any chance for people to receive forgiveness even at 97 years of age? And of course, we Orthodox Christians believe that yes. But I'm not sure if the Ukrainians even bring this philosophical question into play. In fact, they're just playing on the emotions of Western audiences, and it's just a big game for them. Whereas I think what real Christians are concerned about is there actual forgiveness for people? Can people move on? Like me and Conrad, we believe that even Zelensky, even a straight-up cocaine-addicted degenerate who sent his entire country into war, can be forgiven and can actually serve his sentence. And even if he is executed for his crimes, he could, in fact, achieve salvation. Christ is very merciful. So I'm not sure. So that entire neo-Nazi debacle in Canada, I thought it was just a big embarrassment for everybody involved. There's nothing positive came from that, even for the Russian side. I mean, what did it prove? We already knew that the Banderites and neo-Nazis existed. Again, it seems like a big humiliation ritual of some sort.
Well, I just think it's a demonstration that we need to just move on from the stupid World War II dominated narrative. I mean, that's something that happened almost 100 years ago, like from both sides. I mean, because of the Ukrainian situation, the anti-Russia Ukrainian resistance narrative has been boosted so much in the West. Of course, it's going to manifest in Canada, where the Canadian government is basically run by the Canadian government's basically run by the Ukrainian lobby. The Freeland and all the people there. I mean, the Banderite legacy there is strong. So many of those people emigrated to Canada. There's more Ukrainians in Canada, I think, outside of Ukraine than any other country. But of course, then you kind of have the silliness coming from Russia where they're like, oh, we need to get this guy over to The Hague and try him. It's like, look, this guy's 98 years old. He was 18 years old in the army. Maybe he was around for atrocities. Like, let's be honest. Like, almost 100 years later, are we going to, what archaeological evidence are we going to find to support some kind of atrocities? This whole thing is just silly. Like, this guy shouldn't have been ever brought anywhere because he's a veteran of, for Canadians, what is basically an irrelevant war. And then for the Russians, they should, I understand that they basically, you can't not take advantage of that rhetorical strike. I mean, Canada's the most neoliberal government, standing applause for a Nazi regime. You're going to take advantage of it. But, then using this to double down on like the vindictive, I would say, kind of Jewish attitude towards hunting down everyone that even remotely served for the Third Reich, I think that's a bit silly.
Yeah, especially, and it's not really in the, I guess it's not even in how Russia even conducted its foreign policy, even because remember, Napoleon was forgiven, right? Napoleon was sent to an island at the end of his reign. He wasn't executed. What happened to all the French marshals? Russia was very much fond of its clemency and its mercy, especially pre-World War II, and even during World War I. Some of the acts of the Russian soldiers, officers, and even Saint Nicholas II. I mean, Russia was known for its peace-loving, forgiving nature, and I'm not saying that neo-Nazis need to be forgiven. Of course, justice is very important here as well, and there does need to be some sort of new Nuremberg trial run by the Russians, and not even Nuremberg, I think, is a really loaded term, but there does need to be certain justice process carried out for those degenerates in the Ukraine today who carry out atrocities against the people of Lugansk and Donetsk. And in fact, the people of Lugansk and Donetsk, they're the ones who actually wanted justice to be carried out against the Azov battalion combatants in Mariupol who were captured. Recall that they sentenced 3 or 4 Azov battalion prisoners from Mariupol to death because they linked them to crimes committed against Donetsk and Lugansk in the last 8 years. And what did the Russian Federation do? They simply granted amnesty. And in fact, now those Azov battalion's troops were actually carried on Abramovich's yacht to Turkey and then released back into. So this entire talk about this 98-year-old Banderite Nazi somewhere in Canada, and he needs to be taken out like by some neo-Mossad type effort. I think it's just bizarre because the neo-Nazis who Donetsk wanted to execute legally, lawfully in a Christian-like manner. And of course, we know capital punishment is very much in the Christian way of doing justice to the criminals who actually deserve it. It wasn't done because the Russian Federation's justice system took over, and it took those prisoners from Azov and actually transported them back to Turkey on the yacht of an Israeli citizen, Abramovich. Like, this is wild. I'm sorry, maybe I'm getting a bit too passionate, but you look at the entire picture, not just one event, and the entire thing looks like a giant mosaic, and it's not a pretty one either. It looks like something out of Picasso. Either way, I think it's important to just keep a broader view of the picture and just not to hyper-focus on one particular event and just see things for what they really are, which is in fact these bizarre events in the sinful world which build a build a broader view of exactly what's taking place. I think, even though I think our analysis differs from that of other people, we do like to take a more or less objective, maybe Christian opinion of these events, even if it doesn't even favor our side, for example. Like, I think we tend to be even critical of Russia sometimes, and I think it's for the better. And the interview of Gabriel Doroshin actually underlined that for me, because he loves Russia. He moved to the Donbass. He moved to Donetsk. He married a local Donetsk woman, and in fact, this, I guess you could say, almost the future heir to the Russian throne. You could say, futuristically, this Orthodox aristocrat, actually did say that, look, Russia isn't doing everything right, and certain things can be fixed. So I think we have this like a positive, constructivist view of the entire conflict, and especially the political scene which is occurring over there in Eastern Europe. I think that's really important, just to not exactly be tempted by propaganda.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end of the time here, but I think we gave some good analysis on everything that's going on. But you talked about Gabriel DeRoche, I think we should try to get him on the show sometime soon. So I think we're going to be working on that. But with that being said, everyone needs to be sure to check out episode 18, the most recent episode of Ether Hour, our biggest one yet. It's absolutely free, not behind the paywall. However, we would appreciate it if you would listen to it, like it, and then go behind the paywall to hear the other episodes. We can't do this without the support of the people subscribing on worldwarnow.substack.com. But we interviewed Abbot Trifon. It's part of our Uncanonized Saints series. We discuss Elder Dimitri of Santa Rosa, who very little is known about, especially in the English language on the internet. Well, really in any language on the internet, as he was, as they say, glorified in America. He reposed in 1991. And there's some stuff, Abbot Trifon tells some stories where, you're not going to hear it anywhere else. And we hope that he will be canonized very soon, a real fantastic saint of our time. And we're also, next episode of Ether Hour, we've already done the interview. We will be releasing an interview with Father John Whiteford. We talk about the Malankara Russian Orthodox situation of a possible union there, the current situation in the Vatican and the persecutions, as well as the latest publications on the Council on Foreign Relations about priests in America and how they're apparently potential spies for Putin and the Russian regime. So look forward to that. But we've basically hit all of our nodes here. Dimitri, anything else you want to say about the situation in Israel or Ukraine? I mean, there's news going on everywhere, so I'm sure we could just stay on and talk. But what do we? Let's kind of wrap this up, I guess.
Yeah, only that. Again, most of these events, of course, we do not live in Palestine, Israel, so what we receive is basically from mainstream and alternative media, and we do need to be aware that, look, a lot of these sites are using these materials, like the footage of the soldiers, the footage of the victims. We're getting a lot of pretty explicit photographs of the victims of both sides here, and again, this is what usually happens in these particular local skirmishes and conflicts, is that victims emerge very quickly, and of course photographs and footage of victims, and it's all very gruesome. It's similar to the Vietnam War, which was essentially won by, you could say it was won for the Vietnamese by the hippie peace-loving movement, who somehow obtained photographs and footage of what the Americans were doing to the Vietnamese locals, to the Viet Cong, and somehow like pushed it in a certain direction. I mean, that's just one version of how the Vietnam War went. Obviously, there was multiple factors, but the peace movement at home, because they actually received first-hand footage very, very soon after the events took place, pressured the American government into actually signing a peace treaty with the North Vietnamese. And so de facto it was a surrender. So in fact, wars are very different these days. Again, the Ukrainian conflict, on the other hand, does show us that a conflict and war could continue in the modern world despite all of the explicit footage being portrayed. And in fact, some people can be agitated and frustrated to such an extent that no matter what they view on the internet or what kind of things they see, peace will still not be worth it. In fact, peace may be like, for the Ukrainians, it's a losing condition, and for the Russians. And in fact, peace may not be an option, even though peace may be sometimes the best case scenario. In this particular case, I'm not sure what the right thing to do would be. And again, that's why my opinion is more neutral on this side. Although part of me thinks, Conrad, that perhaps a more pro-Palestinian position is the right one, considering they are the underdogs, and considering Israel is supportive of Ukraine, and Israel is the main ally of the United States, and the United States is the large military-industrial globalist complex, which again pushes this degenerate ideology around the world. Israel being the main recipient, for whatever reason, of not just vaccines and Pfizer, but also of the alphabet community LGBT agenda. For some reason, Israel is consuming it as much as anybody, if not more than which is very, very bizarre. It's almost like the population is
Well, part of
preparing
the
itself.
reason Israel is in the situation, right? Part of the reason Israel is in the situation it's in right now is that the ultra-Zionists are completely replacing the liberal secularists in the cities demographically. So, of course, Likud is basically going to be permanently in power demographically. So the extreme expansionist version of Zionism is going to come to the fore, which is the reason this conflict is happening. It's why the Golan Heights happened. It's why all this went down. And if you just listen to Bishop Hannah of the Jerusalem Patriarchate, I mean, it's pretty obvious you want to side with the Palestinians. There's no Orthodox authority that has spoken positively of the state of Israel, whereas the Jerusalem Patriarchate, also if you're Armenian, those churches have talked about it. Even the local Catholics and Anglicans have talked about it. But, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, even other Greeks like Metropolitan Neophytos has talked about this in Cyprus as well. The Israeli authorities are moving in on these monasteries and the Christian quarters. And actually, Abbot Trifon mentions this in our interview with him. He mentions that as right before, they were reaching despair in their life on Vashon Island on the monastery, they weren't able to pay their rent. So they were going to go to Jerusalem and inhabit ancient skeets and monasteries in the desert to prevent them from being taken over by the Zionist authorities. But instead, you have to listen to the episode to hear why and how the miracle occurred where he was able to stay on Vashon Island. But again, I guess if we're on anyone's side, we're on the side of the Orthodox Christian remnant in the Holy Land. And obviously we don't want any conflict to break out because they would then be caught in a perhaps possible crossfire. But there's been conflict there for hundreds and hundreds of years and decades. It's sort of been just a suppressed ongoing war. And so if it's going to come to a close, I have no problem saying that I would hope for the Zionist authority to no longer be in charge when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I think it's been a pretty good episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to it. Obviously these news are simply transpiring. We're simply recording this 7 or 8 hours after I guess you can call it almost the Third Intifada. We're not sure what it would be called the next time you hear our recording, perhaps next week, but it will be very interesting. Perhaps maybe we'll even do a live stream depending on how the situation develops on the ground. But our initial thoughts, I think, will remain unchanged, no matter what occurs, even if it escalates or if this conflict dies down. I think that despite any fact, I think that Israel will remain this particular hot zone, and essentially, as Alexander Dugin recently commented, it is whatever happens in this region is eschatological, just simply because it is where the last chapters of history will take place: the Armageddon, the reign of the Antichrist, the third temple, which even Hamas mentions in their own Islamic understanding of it. So, of course, we Orthodox Christians know that, and our prophecies, like the prophecy of Methodius of Patarsky, they do speak about this, which, at the end of the world will take place in this particular zone. It's not exactly the most positive of places geographically, especially after the crucifixion of Christ and after the massive amounts of persecutions which have taken place here.
Well, in St. Paisios, he talked about, again, the collapse of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the end of the state of Israel as it is known, since it has been since the end of World War II. But, we're leaving you here. I'm sure by the time you're listening to this, Operation Iron Swords will be underway. That is basically what the Israeli government is calling their impending counteroffensive in this new war. So that will be being undertaken. We're watching Hezbollah, and we're watching Saudi Arabia, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, because that's going to be what makes or breaks this. Because as of now, it's most likely Israel is going to retaliate with a vengeance and really, really punish the Palestinians. So with all that being said, worldwarnow.substack.com, subscribe, listen to our latest episodes. We're going to have episode 18 with Abbot Trifon, as well as our new Heavenly Jerusalem episode linked below. So be sure to listen to that free one and then get behind the paywall to hear the really deep lore, because that's an episode that just can't be public. It can't be put anywhere but Substack. So you're going to have to check that out. But yeah, follow us on Twitter, _. Follow me on Twitter at gnomrad. That's gnome with a G. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Follow the World War Now Telegram, World War Now Telly. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, World War Now. Like the videos there, share and comment. We're about to hit 3,000 subscribers, so be sure to do that. Be sure to follow us on Rumble, World War Now. And again, worldwarnow.substack.com is where everything is at. And yeah, if things keep going, we may have to do a live stream this week. So with all that being said, Dimitri, I'll let you send us off.
Thank you guys for watching. Again, pretty crazy news happened this week, but again, we give you guys all the content we can, and we did on our 1 year anniversary, we did take a week off, but we appreciate all of your support, and especially all of our Substack subscribers. You guys make all this happen, and definitely all future projects are thanks to you, and thanks to the time and the money you've provided. So thank you all for all the sponsors and the support. Again, feedback has been really good recently, and especially constructive feedback provided in our DMs, in the Substack comments, and we've taken a lot of things on board. So we always appreciate it, and these things go a long way, especially for independent content creators who essentially have no strings tied to any organizations or businesses, and essentially are, for all intents and purposes, non-profit, except for the fact that, look, we still put a lot of time into the research and the content that we give you, and hopefully it's quite enjoyable. So thank you guys for all your time, and God bless.
From the river to the sea.